Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thanks for joining us. Is Christianity a useful religion to the West? The high-profile atheist Richard Dawkins recently made news by claiming that while still an atheist, he considers himself a cultural Christian because of Christianity's utility in supporting Western cultural and political values, which Dawkins laments are under attack. The former atheist Ayaan Hirsi Ali also recently shared that she became a Christian upon realizing that Christianity is necessary to preserve Western political norms. Now, while Christians may be pleased to hear something positive about their religion for a change, there's some underlying complex and even troubling questions about making the connection between Christianity and utility, especially as it relates to contemporary Western values. What, for example, defines useful, and in response to what specific societal goals? Is Christianity's utility limited to the West alone? Aren't there some Western values that are antithetical to Christianity? And does it even make sense for an atheist to use the moral language of utility at all? Here today to help us get some clarity on these and related questions is Bishop Robert Barron. Well, welcome back to the studio, Bishop. Today we're talking about the putative usefulness of Christianity and whether talking about the faith in that way even makes sense.
Right.
But before we do, what have you been up to recently?
Well, most recently, I visited a farm near Winona. My diocese is very rural, so we have some, bigger cities, Rochester, obviously, where we are now. But most of my diocese is very rural. So I grew up in the suburbs. I don't know much about farming. And I'd run into these folks and I'd say, I'd like to know more about the farm and how do you do it and planting and harvesting. And so this wonderful gentleman who has a farm near Winona invited me, and we finally worked it out in the calendar. So I spent 2 or 3 hours. It was delightful, really. He has one farm is kind of a cattle farm. The other one is he's planting, corn and hay and various things. So we saw a calf was born that very morning. So I met the calf and his mother. But then in the second farm, he got me up on the tractor with the huge contraption behind it, and I actually planted some seed of some kind.
That sounds like a lot of fun.
It was actually. It was fun. And I really mean that I'm happy to get to know what a lot of my people are up to. Like one thing I hear all the time as I go around is we had a lovely winter for Minnesota. It wasn't cold and it was not snowy. Right. Well, of course, the farmers are not happy about that because they need the snow, to water the field.
All right.
So there was great concern about that. But now it has been raining a bit, so they're happier. But anyway, it was a nice adventure I had on the farm.
All right. So it's now to some more abstract matters.
It was not abstract. It was very concrete business. Yeah.
That's right. So the genesis of today's episode is, and I know you've heard of this, is Richard Dawkins. Yeah. Very famously now has claimed he's a cultural Christian, and we'll look at a statement in just a moment. But before we do, can you bring our audience up to speed on who Richard Dawkins is and why it might be surprising to hear that he says anything positive about Christianity at all?
Right. He's one of the 4 horsemen of the new atheism. So Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dawkins were kind of the leading figures. This is now 25 years ago when the new atheists emerged. And Dawkins, I think he's an evolutionary biologist by training, and he's well respected in that field. Even the idea of a meme, that comes from Richard Dawkins, that whole idea. Anyway, he emerges, though, famously as this bitter critic of religion. So he's like Hitchens, I suppose, who had the same kind of vitriolic approach to religion, and Dawkins is just utterly dismissive of the Bible and of Christianity. So, if there's an enemy of the church, you'd say it's Richard Dawkins. Right. So that's why it was, as you say, a bit surprising when he's quite an old man. He must be in his upper 70s or 80, I suppose, comes out with at least something positive to say about Christianity. So
what was new about the new atheism, and how is it faring now?
Yeah, not much in my judgment, I think, except its nastiness. The arguments of the new atheists, Hitchens and company, Sam Harris, they're mostly warmed over arguments from, Feuerbach and Freud and Marx and, the classical atheists. So I didn't find really anything new in their argumentation. What was new is their nastiness, and I would say their dismissal of religion. You read the great atheists like a Nietzsche or Marx or Freud even, you get the sense they're dealing with something very serious, and they're opposed to it, to be sure, but they know they're up against a formidable enemy and that they're in a really fundamental struggle. With the new atheists, and to me it was a sign of their intellectual superficiality, it's like religion is sort of like an idiot child that we just have to kind of get off the stage as quickly as possible. And, there was such a crude dismissal of this very rich intellectual tradition, and they gave no indication of having engaged it in any way. You read Hitchens and Dawkins too. It was, picking out the very, very, very worst elements in religious behavior over the centuries and saying that's what it's all about. But no serious engagement of the Bible, Augustine, Aquinas, Newman, people like that. So I was never impressed by the new atheist. It was new in its nastiness. New, I think, too, in its evangelical verve. They were darn good evangelists for their position. And I know that because they convinced a lot of people in, let's say, the last generation, the last 20, 25 years. I hear the rhetoric of Dawkins and Harris and company every day online from people. Whenever someone goes, "Oh, the Bible, Bronze Age mythology." Okay, you've been reading, Dawkins, or God is as crazy as, or God is like King Lear in Act 5, except God's crazier. They've been reading Dawkins. So they were good evangelists. They were rhetorically gifted, and they were willing to kind of get out there and use the new media, all of that. Now to the final question you raised. They're not doing well now, it seems to me. I think their time passed quickly. And in fact, when we touch on this, there's a revival of something else going on right now, where I think a lot of the people who heard the new atheists and bought it for the moment are realizing what a hopelessly nihilistic vision it is. And they're turning, I think, back to religion in serious ways.
That's right. It doesn't work out well when applied, right?
Right. Well, I come from nothing. I'm going nowhere. There's no moral value. My life has absolutely no meaning. Oh, great. Great. So when that really sinks in, well, then what do you have? You have nothing.
Well, let's now turn to Dawkins' statement. So he said this in a recent interview, and he's speaking specifically about the United Kingdom, but for him it means the West generally. So here's the quote. "I do think we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there is a distinction between being a believing Christian and a cultural Christian." So first, Bishop, what do you think about making this sort of distinguishing move between saying, well, there's people called believing Christians and there's people called cultural Christians? Is this a helpful move sociologically, morally, and theologically?
Not finally, no. I guess I can see a certain legitimacy if he's saying there are elements within the classically Christian cultures that I like. Right? Whether they're moral, they're aesthetic, whatever. Even as I repudiate the dogmatic claims. I think there are a lot of people who have embraced that kind of position. I remember this years ago when I was a student in France. François Mitterrand was the president. Mitterrand was a socialist and a non-believer. And he was quoted at one point saying well, I love the ethics, but la métaphysique, is ridiculous. And that's kind of the Dawkins position. So Mitterrand admired the moral system that came out of Christianity, but, no one takes the metaphysics seriously. So I'm familiar with the position, and I think you can make it in at least a superficial way.
So in the same interview, Dawkins goes on, because one way to read him is saying, well, he's just expressing his personal preference for some of the values of Christianity. But he takes makes a deeper move there, and he says that he actually prefers Christianity over other religions and other belief systems, precise because of its treatment of women. And he also expresses displeasure at the possibility of losing what he calls beautiful parishes and cathedrals. And he ends with this quote. He says, "So I call myself a cultural Christian, and I think it would be truly dreadful if we substituted any other alternative religion." So how do we understand Dawkins' moral logic here? He's saying that on the one hand, he doesn't believe in Christianity, and yet on the other hand, he wants to retrieve some kind of apparently objective good out of it. Does that make any sense?
Ultimately, no. And the reason is the transcendentals are connected. And I think a lot of our viewers know that the three great transcendentals of the true, the good, and the beautiful, they're features of being, so Aquinas would say. Whenever there's the real, you find these three elements. Well, he's putting his finger on two of them, right? So when he says the way Christianity treats women, he probably means that ethically speaking, there's something very admirable about the way Christianity has embraced the poor and so on and so forth. Those who led the charge against slavery were largely Christians and so on. So that's the good, that's the ethical side. And then he touches on the beautiful. So when you see parish churches, and I remember another interview some years ago, he talked about being out in the English countryside and hearing the ringing of the bells and how he preferred that to other forms of religious music he's heard around the world. And he said that he much prefers to be in that environment. Okay, there is the beautiful that he's finding compelling. Where I would press him is to say, precisely because the beautiful, the good, and the true are connected to each other, the first two ought to lead you to the third. It should lead you at least to wonder, okay, why has Christianity given rise to these ethical convictions that I admire and to these beautiful buildings that I admire? Why? And I would suggest it's because they're grounded in a series of truth claims. And if you try to divide them, right? So I don't believe it. I don't believe any of that. But I like these other two things. It's the cut flowers thing. That's that Will Hertzberg, isn't that his name, that famously said, so flowers are growing in the earth. You cut them out of the earth. You put them in water. Well, they'll flourish for a time. They'll look great for a few days, but then very quickly they're going to fade. Well, that's what we're dealing with here. If you say, yeah, I love the ethical system. I love the aesthetics of Christianity. Let me cut them out of the earth of Christian dogma, put them in a glass. Well, there they are. I love Christian culture. Look at it. But that's going to fade away if you take these flowers out of the earth of Christian belief. So that's why in the long run, what he's proposing is not going to work. Now, I want to say glass is half full. All right, I'll start with that. That's a pretty good concession. In fact, excellent concession. If he really believes, both in terms of ethics and aesthetics, Christianity's given rise to this wonderful thing. All right, I can build on that, and try to show now the link. Chartres Cathedral didn't just come out of nowhere. It grew up out of the soil of Christian belief, the Incarnation and the Old Testament and the Blessed Mother and so on. And the opposition to slavery, let's say, didn't fall out of the sky. It came up out of a rather loamy biblical and philosophical tradition associated with Christianity. So I'm always aware of Will Hertzberg. I'm always aware of that. A lot of people subscribe to that today. I love the flowers, but I'm not crazy about the earth that gave rise to them.
Yeah, and it's important to keep in mind that sort of the premise of this interview for Dawkins is that he's lamenting the sort of the wane of Christian culture. Yeah. And so that's why he's trying to praise it, but he doesn't seem aware of why it might be waning. So let's hone in a little bit more on the fact that he's making an argument for utility as an atheist, not as an agnostic. It seems that the whole idea of utility as a concept really only makes sense, usefulness, if it's in relationship to some final goal, right? It's instrumental by definition. So something's only useful insofar as it leads to something else. But isn't, from an atheistic perspective, aren't all final goals ultimately arbitrary? So how can we even speak of utility as a coherent concept? Yeah, no, I think you're right. I don't think you really can, because it's got to be, it's like our previous conversation about the ordered nature of the goods. If something's instrumental, that means I'm using it for some good. All right, and then that good situates itself how in relation to the highest good. So ultimately, you can't bracket final causality. That's the issue we're dealing with. And that's a mark of modernity, of course, is a bracketing of final causality. Right. That becomes a matter of subjective opinion. So you want what you want, and she wants what she wants. But the system will not sustain itself under those conditions. So no, I quite agree with that. I'd ask him again, what's the summum bonum for you? What is it? What's the highest good? Something. And are you recognizing at least a participation in it when you recognize these ethical and aesthetic values? I might begin to press it that way with them. There's also certainly a cafeteria pick and choose a move that he makes with regards to Christianity, because he also wants it crystal clear for the audience that he does not agree with the Christian conception of the nature of human sexuality. And so there's another sort of meta-ethical dimension or question here, and that's, so let's say that you're looking at Christianity and you're saying, well, these values are good and these values are bad, so we're going to keep these but discard these. what do we say about that system that making that evaluative judgment? Again, can atheism even support any system at all that makes those judgments?
Yeah, I think no. I think that's the problem, is it collapses under its own weight because it brackets the summum bonum question. And when you do that, the other goods fall apart as well. Because, go right back here to Aquinas' fourth argument for God's existence, right? When he's beginning with, well, we name things according to better or worse, not generically here, but in terms of the transcendental. We say something is more or less good, true, or beautiful. Well, I can do that, Aquinas says, only in relation to something that at least implicitly and coetly I perceive as highest in truth and goodness and beauty. And that which is highest in those areas is that which has those qualities in an absolute way, and therefore is the creator and ground of the limited instances I can see in the world. I know I'm speaking rather abstractly here, but it's to the point of even to perceive something as a good, right. Even to say, this is better than that, and that's better than both of those. To make those moves, implicitly I'm affirming a highest good or true or beautiful. If the atheist says, oh no, God talk is just silly, nonsensical, well then my capacity to make those evaluative moves also collapses, and it all becomes subjectivized. Now, welcome to our society in many ways, where all these things have become subjectivized. Right. Who are you to tell me what to believe? Who are you to tell me what to do? Now, of course, you can run around that because you've now just named, well, that must be a value for you objectively. I mean, not just for you, but objectively. Right. Because you're appealing to me to say, hey, you should honor this value of mine. Well, why? If it's only subjective. So, I mean, you can't really sustain a purely subjectivistic approach. You can't. Everyone's got some objective value. If you do, and you keep pressing that, then you're going to get to the summum bonum. So that's how I would play that game if I were doing it, in dialogue with them.
So let's turn to someone else who's famously now used sort of the utility of Christianity as an argument in support of Christianity. This is the women's right campaigner and once atheist. She's actually says she's converted. Ayaan Hirsi Ali. So in a widely read article entitled "Why I Am Now a Christian," which she explicitly says this. She's writing against Bertrand Russell, who says "Why I'm Not a Christian" in his famous essay. She writes the following. So I'll read the quote and then get your reaction to it. She says, "The freedom of conscience and speech is perhaps the greatest benefit of Western civilization. It does not come naturally to man. It's the product of centuries of debate within Jewish and Christian communities. It was these debates that advanced science and reason, diminished cruelty, suppressed superstitions, and built institutions to order and protect life while guaranteeing freedom to as many people as possible." So atheism, she says, cannot support these values. Christianity can, therefore Christianity is the right answer.
Well, first of all, good for her, because that's a very important insight. Tom Holland makes it as well, that these things we take for granted in the West, like, oh, everyone believes that, right? Well, obviously, no. In fact, across the centuries and even today, an awful lot of people don't believe that. Why do they believe, for example, in the, as the Pope just put it, the infinite dignity of the individual? Why would we hold that every human being should be respected? Did Julius Caesar believe that? Clearly not. Is it believed today, let's say, in totalitarian societies? Clearly not. So what is it? Where'd that come from? And Holland's answer, and I think her implicit answer is, it comes from the Bible. It comes from a keen sense of creation. We've been created in God's image and likeness, and more to it, the Christ who was crushed and put to death by a totalitarian system was raised by God from the dead and declared Lord of the nations. And therefore, an embrace of the victim, the marginalized, the David against Goliath and all of that comes up out of the Christian heritage. And so it's not accidental. And that's the point she's making and Holland makes, I think, is worth making. Because as you well know, it was at the Enlightenment that, an attempt was made to find these kind of universal. Isn't it obviously true that? Now, whether you're talking about Immanuel Kant or Thomas Jefferson, they often forgot or they overlooked that they were coming out of a Christian mentality. They thought they were finding some kind of pure abstract universal space beyond the religions and all that. They weren't. They look at Kant's second form of the categorical imperative is the golden rule. I mean, they're conditioned by Christianity at every turn. Jefferson acknowledging that endowed by our Creator, good, But see, not everyone believes in the Creator. It certainly was not believed in the ancient world. So where's that coming from? It's coming up out of at least the fumes of a Christian culture, right, that was still around at the Enlightenment. So anyway, I love the point that she's making, that Holland makes, is worth making today.
So affirming the value of that deep insight about the relationship between Christianity and those values of the West. She's also making, there's some sort of a logical move she's making that we sort of break down into this kind of syllogism. We could say, she says, Western values are good. Christianity is necessary to have Western values, therefore Christianity is good. But then there's a sort of another conclusion that she then adds on, therefore it's good to be Christian, or therefore Christianity is true. Is there a problem with her moral logic or her logic there?
Yeah, as stated there, I think there is. But it's honoring, at least implicitly, that connection between the transcendentals that I was hinting at. So that she's following, it seems to me, the good in the direction of the true, which is a good instinct, So where does it come from? Where do these values come from? You can't bracket that question finally. I think you have to engage that question. And again, I don't know where she stands actually in terms of, do you believe in one God, the Father Almighty? Do you believe in Jesus Christ? Do you believe in the Holy Spirit? I don't know. Is she willing and able to make those confessions? Because it's not enough to say, I really admire the moral values of Christianity, as great as that is. Or even, I really admire the buildings and the artwork produced by Christianity, as great as they are. You do finally have to link all the transcendentals together, right? And then, because the church, when someone's baptized or confirmed, it doesn't say, are you against slavery? Do you believe that the individual should be respected? It doesn't ask you moral questions. It asks doctrinal questions. Right. I'll do it tonight when I confirm these kids here. I'm going to say, do you believe in one God? Do you believe in Jesus Christ? Do you believe in the Holy Spirit? So that's interesting that the church has asked that kind of question rather than, or do you think Chartres Cathedral is beautiful? Yes, I do. All right, you're in. I hope they think it's beautiful, but I don't ask those questions. I ask doctrinal questions.
Right.
And I think that matters.
So we'll move on to a related topic in just a moment, but just pressing on the sort of the logic that she seems to be using here. As you well know, and we've talked about extensively, Western values does not only include the dignity of the individual and freedom of conscience. It also includes, under the category of autonomy, what Christianity would consider great evils, abortion and polyamorous relationships and euthanasia and so on and forth. So if the justification for Christianity is that it supports Western values, but then there's some Western values that contradict Christianity, where does that leave sort of the status of Christianity?
Well, no, it's just acknowledging that some values that have emerged in the West have not come from Christianity. They've come from other sources. So I think a lot of that comes from Nietzsche and Sartre and Foucault, and it comes from this sort of postmodern insistence upon the primacy of the will. And none of that is Christian. In fact, I've always identified that as an ancient Christian heresy, a kind of voluntarism. And it was the great Joseph Ratzinger in the Regensburg Address. That's what he was talking about in that famous speech. Became infamous. But the danger of voluntarism. And it's an ancient problem. It comes right up through the tradition, and it massively expresses itself in Nietzsche and then people like Foucault in the 20th century. And I think it's now the default position of most teenagers in America is a kind of voluntarism, that the will has primacy over the intellect. Whenever you make that move, you are in serious trouble. Whether you're doing it theologically, as some did in the Middle Ages, or then you start doing it, you transpose the language about God into anthropological language. And now it becomes my will is so sovereign. It's sovereign even over being. So when Descartes, for example, who had a voluntaristic streak, said, well, if God wanted 2 + 2 to equal 5, it would. Right? Descartes says that. And that's coming up out of Occam and that tradition. Well, what if some of the crazy wokest people say today? Well, 2 + 2 is 4. That's oppressive, patriarchal. It could be 5 if you want it to be. See, that's not just a weird contemporary thing. That's a very ancient problem. It's voluntarism. So I would argue that that's come from a bad place. It's come not from Christianity, from other cultural sources. And so we should stand athwart all that business.
Are there any dangers also with specifically linking, or let's say exclusively linking Christianity to the West? Are Western values, are they the only values that are consonant with Christianity?
No, that's a good point. And when we say the West, a lot of people, yes, indeed, Christianity is in there, but the Enlightenment, a lot they'll mean the values of the Enlightenment. And there, I agree with the postmodern critics who would say things like, well, who died and made the Enlightenment the supreme source of value?
Amen.
Why would an Enlightenment way of knowing, which is a particular path, it's a particular, read Kant if you want to see a careful description of it. Okay, but why is that the only form of rationality? So there, I'd agree with some of the postmoderns who say, why would you identify Western Enlightenment thinking as the only normative way of thinking? I'm there with the nostalgic postmoderns, they call themselves, who say, we want to get behind modernity. We're nostalgic for forms of knowing that were earlier than the Enlightenment. So there, I'm sympathetic with them.
So, sort of moving to summarize the conversation, is it helpful from an evangelical perspective, speaking to the secularized mind, to speak about the utility of Christianity? Is that a good evangelical strategy?
Well, here's my thing with evangelization. I used to tell my students this. You got to be very nimble. And you're like a tennis player. Yeah. And you're playing this opponent, and you don't know where the ball's going to go. And so you got to have a good backhand, you got to have a good forehand, you got to be able to move up in the court well, you got to move back in the court, you got to have a good lob shot, you got to have a good drop shot, because you don't know. It's right. A game. And so if you say, well, here's how you should evangelize. No. It's like saying, here's how you play tennis. You got to be very nimble to play tennis well. So I find in my years of doing evangelization, depends on the opponent. I don't know, does he have a strong serve? Does he have a strong forehand? Oh, no, that guy's got a good backhand. So you do what works. So I would take something like Dawkins and do the glass half full thing. Say, all right, good. Thank you. I agree with you. But now let's press it, So I take his strong forehand, but if I got a good backhand to return that shot, so that's what I would do. Not look at it negatively, but take whatever you can. Shift the metaphor. You have to have a lot of little medicines in the black bag. When you're going to go to deal with someone pastorally, you don't know. You don't know where they're going to be, what their issues are, what their pathologies might be, what their hang-ups are. So you better have a lot of things in your bag, I've always resisted, and you read it in books sometimes on evangelization. Here are the 5 steps. Yeah, okay, that might work in some cases, and great, fine. But it's never like that. It's always you got to play a lot of tennis. And that's, I think over the years of teaching, giving talks and lectures, especially online, when you're playing a lot of games of tennis, and then what shots you need, to engage this player. I think that's evangelization.
So it's now time for our listener question. Okay. Today's question comes from Samuel in Wisconsin, who's wondering how to respond to a very common critique that atheists make about why Christians believe.
Okay.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Samuel from Wisconsin. My question is, how would you respond to the typical atheist claim that religious people are religious because they refuse to come to terms with their own mortality? That simply put, they're afraid of death, and therefore cling to a fairy tale to avoid the grim prospect of utter non-existence. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I have zero sympathy with that, because that's an example of what they call the genetic fallacy, which is if I can understand where a belief came from, I've learned something about its truth or falsity. And that's just a fallacy. Let's say it's true that when I was a young man, I was so terrified of death that I started embracing religious ideas. Does that mean my religious ideas are false? Not necessarily. It could mean that, but I think you got to take the religious ideas on their own terms. And what I would do when I hear that argument, turn it right around. There are all kinds of psychological motivations for atheism. I can think of a lot of them. I'm an atheist because I want to be in charge of my own life. I don't want God telling me what to do. I'm an atheist because I don't like, moral strictures placed on me. There's all kinds of psychological motivations for atheism. So there's a tu quoque way, it's like, well, you're doing the exact same thing. But also, I would never make that argument as an argument, because that's the genetic fallacy again. If you were to say, you're right, I really don't want to have a moral, boss in my life. Well, that still wouldn't say whether your non-belief is true or false. Right. So it's just a non-starter. It's a bit of a red herring that way too. People will trot that out, and it accomplishes accomplishes nothing in terms of determining truth. And it's completely susceptible to a tu quoque.
Well, thanks so much, Samuel, for reaching out to us. If you'd like to ask Bishop Barron a question for a future Word on Fire show, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com. Well, we're at the end again, Bishop. Always a great delight to be with you.
Thanks, Matt. Always enjoy the conversation.
Thank you. That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. We'll see you next time.